Imagine for a moment that you have nowhere to be. No meetings, no deadlines, no one calling your name. The sun is warm but not too hot. There is a faint smell of bread baking somewhere nearby, and the sound of water trickling from a fountain is the loudest thing you can hear. You are not in your living room. You are not in this century. You are standing in the middle of ancient Rome on a quiet Sunday morning, and absolutely nothing urgent is happening. Nobody is rushing. Nobody is shouting. The city that once conquered the world has, for today, decided to do absolutely nothing about it, and you are going to follow along. You are going to sit down beside a Roman baker who just closed his shop, walk slowly with an old senator who has nowhere important to go, and watch children play games in the street that have not been played for 2,000 years. This is not a story about war. This is not a story about emperors or battles or the rise and fall of empires. This is a story about one ordinary lazy day in the most powerful city the ancient world had ever seen, told in the slowest, most comfortable, most unhurried way possible. So if you are lying down right now, go ahead and close your eyes a little. Pull the blanket up just a little higher. Because we are going all the way back to ancient Rome, and we are going to take our sweet, beautiful time getting there. All you have to do is keep listening. The city of Rome in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era was a place that never truly slept. But it did have its rhythms, its ebbs and flows, its quieter hours and its louder ones. And the day that the Romans called dies solis, the day of the sun, which would eventually find its way into our calendar as Sunday, was one of those days when the rhythm slowed considerably. The Romans did not observe Sunday as a formal day of rest in the way that later Christian traditions would come to organize it. That particular transformation would come gradually over centuries, solidified officially only in the year 321 of the Common Era, when the Emperor Constantine declared it a public day away from work in the cities. But long before that official declaration, the cycles of Roman life naturally created softer days, days when the dye merchants kept their shutters half closed, when the fuller who cleaned and treated woolen cloth left his vats to soak without him, when the schoolmaster dismissed his students a little earlier than usual and walked home slowly through streets that smelled of yesterday's bread and this morning's rosemary. To understand what a lazy day felt like in Rome, you have to first understand what a busy day felt like, because the contrast is everything. A normal Roman workday began before the sun had fully pulled itself above the horizon. The city came alive in darkness. The bakers, called pistors, had already been at their mills for hours, grinding grain and shaping loaves that would be ready as the light arrived. Rome at its peak population held somewhere between 1 and 2 million people, and feeding that many mouths required a machine that never entirely stopped. The streets before dawn were filled with the sound of cart wheels. Because wheeled vehicles were actually banned from the city center during daylight hours to prevent the catastrophic traffic jams that Roman streets, narrow and winding, and not designed for carts, would otherwise suffer. So the night belonged to deliveries, to the groan of wooden wheels over stone, to the calls of drivers urging their animals forward through the dark. By the time the sun rose, the carts retreated and the people emerged. Rome's streets filled almost immediately with a density of human activity that would feel overwhelming to a modern person. Vendors called out from their stalls, selling everything from hot chickpea soup to second-hand sandals. Schoolchildren sat outside their teachers' doorways, learning to recite Latin and Greek in a kind of organized outdoor chaos. Lawyers walked briskly toward the forum with their clients trailing behind them like anxious ducklings. Senators in their broad-striped togas made their way to the Senate House for debates that could last all day and accomplish very little. Slaves carried messages, parcels, litters, water, wood, grain. Soldiers moved in small groups. Priests conducted morning rituals at the dozens of temples that studded the city like punctuation marks on a very crowded page, and over all of it, the noise. The Romans themselves complained constantly about the noise. The poet Juvenal, writing in the late 1st century, described the city as a place where sleep was reserved only for the very wealthy who could afford houses set back from the street. While everyone else lay awake listening to cart wheels and arguments, and the sound of a coppersmith working at all hours. The philosopher Seneca, who actually lived above a bathhouse for a time, wrote with wry resignation about the grunts of men exercising, the splashing of bathers, the cries of the sausage seller. The cake man and the lard seller, each with their own distinct and penetrating call. So yes, a busy day in Rome was genuinely, overwhelmingly, spectacularly busy. Which makes the quieter days, the slower days, the lazy Sundays before Sunday had a formal name, feel all the more precious, because even Rome exhaled sometimes. Even that great roaring city grew soft around the edges on certain mornings, and let its people simply be. On one of those slower mornings, let us imagine we are in the Subura district, which was one of Rome's most densely populated neighborhoods. A place of tall apartment buildings called insulae that rose 4, 5, 6 stories into the sky, crammed with families, single workers, small shops on the ground floors, and an almost unbelievable amount of daily life compressed into a very small space. The Subura sat in a valley between the Esquiline and Viminal hills, and it had a reputation as a rough and lively place, full of ordinary Romans going about their ordinary lives. This was not the marble Rome of the emperors. This was the Rome of people who worried about rent and gossiped with their neighbors and had strong opinions about the chariot races. It is morning. The light is coming in through a small window that has no glass because glass windows in apartment buildings were still a luxury. And the air that moves through it carries the smell of the city waking up, which is a complicated smell. There is wood smoke and bread and something less pleasant underneath, because the sanitation of ancient Rome, impressive as its engineering was in some respects, was not always what we might wish it to be. But on this particular morning, the unpleasant notes fade quickly because someone on a lower floor has opened a window and the smell of fresh herbs. Perhaps thyme or oregano or sweet marjoram growing in a small pot on a windowsill drifts upward and is kind about it. Marcus, who we will call Marcus because it was one of the most common Roman names, and there was almost certainly at least one Marcus in every apartment building in Rome, is 34 years old. He works most days as a copyist, sitting in a scriptorium and reproducing texts by hand for the book trade, which in Rome was a real and functioning industry centered largely on the area around the Argultum, a neighborhood near the Forum known for its booksellers. But today there is no work. The workshop is closed. The owner of the scriptorium is observing a religious festival associated with one of the minor deities of the household. And he has given his workers the day without explanation, beyond a brief gesture of dismissal, and the implicit understanding that they should not appear until tomorrow. Marcus lies on his sleeping pallet for a little longer than usual. In that pleasant state that exists between sleep and waking where the body is still heavy, and the mind moves very slowly through vague and comfortable thoughts. His pallet is a simple affair, a wooden frame strung with leather or rope and covered with a wool-stuffed mattress, and it sits in a room that serves multiple purposes because in a Roman apartment. Rooms did not have assigned functions the way modern rooms do. The space where he sleeps is also where he eats when he eats alone, where he keeps his few possessions in a wooden chest, and where he sometimes reads in the evening light from the oil lamp that hangs from a hook in the wall. He has a second room connected to this one where his wife Flavia and their 2 children, a girl of 7 and a boy of 5, have been sleeping. He can hear the children already stirring because children, in any century, do not observe the concept of sleeping in. The apartment building they live in is 5 stories tall. They live on the 3rd floor, which is neither the most desirable floor, which is the first floor where the rooms are largest and most substantial, nor the least desirable, which is the top floor where the rent is cheapest, because you are farthest from the street-level water source and also most at risk in the event of a fire. Fires in Rome were a genuine and constant anxiety. The city burned with some regularity, and the apartment buildings, constructed largely of wood and brick with wooden internal floors and staircases, were vulnerable. The Emperor Augustus had organized a force of 7,000 men called the Vigils, who served as a combined night watch and firefighting corps, and their presence made life somewhat safer. But every Roman who lived in an insula understood at some level that fire was not an abstract danger. But we are not thinking about fire today. Today is slow and the morning light is kind, and the children are making small, cheerful sounds in the next room, and Flavia is saying something to them in the patient, slightly sleepy tone of a mother who is not quite ready to be awake, but is accepting the situation with grace. Marcus gets up. He does not have the dressing ritual of a wealthier Roman. He does not have a personal attendant to help him put on his toga, to hand him his rings, to bring him his carefully arranged morning robe. He pulls on his tunic, which is the basic undergarment of Roman life for men and women alike, a simple T-shaped garment of wool or linen that falls to the knee. And he ties a belt around it, and that is essentially his outfit for the day. The toga, that magnificent, complicated piece of fabric that is so strongly associated with Rome in the modern imagination, was actually reserved for formal occasions and worn only by Roman citizens. On an ordinary lazy day at home, even the most respectable Roman man simply wore his tunic. He goes to the window and looks out at the street below. The street at this hour is quieter than usual. There are a few people moving about. A woman with a water jar balanced on her head making her way from the nearest public fountain. A dog investigating something at the base of a wall, with the intense focused interest that only dogs bring to such investigations. A very old man sitting on a step and watching the morning with the proprietary calm of someone who has watched many mornings from this exact spot. The cart traffic of the night has stopped, and the daytime bustle has not yet fully begun. There is a quality to this hour that is almost gentle, which for Rome is saying something. Breakfast for Marcus and his family is uncomplicated. Roman cuisine, particularly for people of ordinary means, did not involve elaborate morning preparations. The Roman relationship with food was different from ours in terms of when they ate and how much they expected those meals to be. The main meal of the Roman day was the cena, the dinner, taken in the late afternoon or early evening. Before that, breakfast was typically small, and lunch, if eaten at all, was a brief pause rather than a full meal. Marcus has bread, which Flavia has obtained from the baker on the ground floor of the building or from one of the many thermopolia. The hot food shops that lined Roman streets and sold prepared food to the enormous population of Romans who either could not cook because they had no kitchen facilities in their apartments, or who simply preferred the convenience of buying their food ready-made. The bread is dense and round, baked in a domed oven, and it has a slightly sour and weedy smell that fills the room when Flavia breaks it into pieces. They have olives preserved in brine from a jar, and there is a small amount of cheese, hard and sharp and pale, and there is pasca, which is a mixture of water and wine vinegar that Romans of moderate means often drank instead of wine in the morning. It sounds unpleasant to the modern ear, but was actually a practical and fairly tasty beverage, and the combination of mild acidity with a small amount of honey made it refreshing rather than harsh. The children eat with the focused determination that children bring to food when they have not yet learned to pretend they are not hungry. After breakfast, and this is where the day begins to take on its lazy Sunday quality, There is no particular plan, and this, in its own quiet way, is a luxury. The Romans were an extremely plan-oriented people in their public and formal life. The calendar was covered in festivals, market days, court days, days declared auspicious, and days declared inauspicious for various activities. The legal and political calendar was exhaustive. There were days for starting lawsuits and days when courts could not sit, days for voting assemblies and days when the gods required public ceremonies. The machinery of Roman civic life ran on a very detailed schedule. But within that structure, on the days that fell between the official demands, ordinary Romans had their own time. And what they did with it reveals something important about what they actually valued when the city was not asking anything of them. What Marcus values on this particular morning is a trip to the baths. And in this, he is utterly typical of his city and his time, because the public bath, the thermae, was arguably the most important institution in the daily life of an ordinary Roman. To call it a bathhouse is to dramatically undersell it. The great bath complexes of Rome were architectural and social marvels. Even the smaller neighborhood baths, the balnea, were something far beyond a place to wash. They were community centers, social gathering places, exercise facilities, conversation hubs, and for many Romans who lived in apartments without running water or heating. They were the primary means by which one could get warm, get clean, and get some kind of human connection outside one's immediate family circle. Marcus does not go to the grandest baths. The great imperial bath complexes, the baths of Agrippa, the baths of Nero, the baths of Trajan, which would eventually be succeeded by the even more magnificent baths of Caracalla and Diocletian, were extraordinary places that could hold thousands of bathers at once. But there were also hundreds of smaller bath establishments throughout the city, many of them situated conveniently in neighborhoods so that residents did not have to walk far. The one Marcus frequents is a 5-minute walk from his apartment, a neighborhood bath that has been operated by the same family for 2 generations. The entrance fee is minimal. Some accounts suggest it was a quadrans, the smallest coin in Roman currency, roughly equivalent to the cost of a single grain roll, and on certain days and at certain hours. The baths might even be free, paid for by a wealthy patron seeking public goodwill or celebrating some personal occasion. Women and men typically bathed at separate hours or in separate sections, and Flavia will come with her neighbor Tertia, whom she has been friends with since they both moved into this building 7 years ago, in the later morning while Marcus goes now. He walks to the baths, and on a lazy morning, walking is itself a pleasure rather than a task. The streets of the Subura are alive but not frantic. He passes a barber, a tonsтрix, who has set up his chair outside and is already attending to a customer, the scrape of the iron razor audible as Marcus passes. Roman barbers occupied an interesting social position. They were skilled professionals, but their shops were also notorious centers of gossip and long conversation. A Roman getting a shave was not getting a quick trim. He was settling in for a social event. The barber and customer are engaged in what appears to be a deeply satisfying conversation about something related to the outcome of a recent chariot race. And the barber's hands move with the automatic confidence of long practice, while his mouth moves even faster. Marcus passes a small shrine at a street corner, a lararium set into the wall at the junction of 2 streets, with a painted image of the Lares, the divine protectors of the neighborhood, and below them a snake, symbol of the spirit of the place. Someone has left a small garland of fresh herbs at the base of the shrine, and a pinch of incense is burning in a tiny brazier. The smell of it, sweet and resinous, drifts into the morning air. Religion for the Romans was not something separate from daily life. It was woven into every street corner, every doorway, every meal and journey and business deal. The gods were not remote beings to be addressed only in formal worship. They were present, particular, local. The Lar of this street junction was not the same deity as the Lar of the next street junction. Each neighborhood, each crossroads, each household had its own divine presences, and acknowledging them was as natural and unremarkable as noticing the weather. The bath is warm when he arrives, which is the point. The great achievement of Roman bath technology was the hypocaust system, an underfloor heating method in which hot air from a furnace, tended by slaves or attendants, circulated through hollow spaces beneath the floor and inside the walls, raising the temperature of the rooms in a graduated sequence. The Roman bath moved through a series of rooms of increasing heat. The apoditerium was the changing room, where bathers left their clothes in niches in the wall or under the watch of an attendant. Because theft at the baths was apparently common enough to be a recurring complaint in Roman literature. Then came the frigidarium, the cold room with its plunge pool of unheated water. The tepidarium was next, a warm intermediate room where bathers could acclimatize. And then the caldarium, the hot room, which contained basins of hot water and was filled with steam and the sounds of splashing and conversation. There was sometimes also a laconicum, a dry heat room similar to what we would recognize as a sauna. The process of bathing was itself quite different from what a modern person would expect. Romans did not use soap in the way we do. Instead, bathers would apply olive oil to their skin, sometimes scented with herbs or flowers, and then scrape it off along with the accumulated dirt using a curved metal tool called a strigil. The combination of oil, scraping, steam, and hot water was apparently extremely effective, and the Romans were by all accounts quite clean. The bath attendants, if you paid for them, would assist with this process, oiling and scraping and massaging with a practiced efficiency that made the whole thing deeply relaxing. For Marcus, who does not pay for an attendant today because he is watching his expenses, and also because he knows how to manage the strigil himself well enough. The process is a solitary but pleasant one. What makes the baths particularly enjoyable on a day like this is the social texture of the place. Romans talked at the baths. They argued, they gossiped, they made business arrangements, they flirted. They recited poetry to captive audiences who could not easily leave without appearing to snub the performer. On busier days, the noise could be considerable. Seneca, again from his apartment above the baths, described hearing the sound of men working out in the exercise yard. The high-pitched voices of hair pluckers advertising their services by calling out through the rooms, the splash of someone doing a particularly enthusiastic cannonball type jump into the pool. But today the bath is quiet enough to feel almost contemplative. The men who are here this morning move slowly and speak in low voices. Someone is discussing agriculture. Someone else is disputing a figure from a recent business transaction with a resigned rather than angry tone. A very old man is simply floating on his back in the warm pool with his eyes closed, and the expression of someone who has successfully solved every problem he ever had. Marcus ends up in conversation with his neighbor Gaius, who lives on the second floor and works as a courier for one of the city's trading firms. Gaius is a compact and energetic man who is, even in the bath, in slight motion, unable to completely stop the fidgeting that is his natural state. He has strong opinions about almost everything, and he shares them freely and cheerfully, without malice, but also without excessive concern for whether you asked. Today he is describing a journey he made recently to the port of Ostia, Rome's harbor city at the mouth of the Tiber, and the conversation drifts from the ships he saw unloading grain from Egypt. Enormous vessels called corbita that carried the grain on which Rome depended. To a description of a meal he had at a tavern near the docks that he considers the finest meal he has eaten in recent memory. To the question of whether the new aqueduct being extended on the Esquiline Hill will actually improve water pressure in their neighborhood or merely divert it elsewhere. This is the rhythm of Roman bath conversation. It moves without urgency from one subject to another, circling back occasionally to something mentioned earlier, following the path of interest rather than any particular purpose. Marcus listens more than he speaks. He has always been this way, more comfortable as an audience than a performer, which is perhaps what made him suited for the patient, quiet work of copying manuscripts. He finds Gaius's relentless talking oddly soothing, like a stream that keeps moving whether you follow it or not. After an hour and a half at the baths, clean and warm and pleasantly loose in his muscles, Marcus makes his way back out into the street. The sun has risen properly now, and the day has settled into its late morning quality, golden and unhurried. He stops at a stall on the way back and buys a small cup of lentil soup from a street vendor. It costs almost nothing, and it is thick and herby and warm, seasoned with cumin and a little pepper. And he drinks it standing at the stall because there is nowhere to sit, and because standing there drinking soup in the morning sunshine is, in this moment, as good a thing as he can imagine doing. Now let us leave Marcus for a little while and walk across the city, because Rome on a lazy day is not a single experience. It is many experiences happening simultaneously in many different places, and the city is large enough and varied enough that it contains all of them at once. On the Palatine Hill, where Rome's wealthiest citizens, and eventually the emperors themselves, maintain their grand houses and sprawling palaces. The experience of a slow day is entirely different in its texture, while sharing something of the same quality of ease. In one of the great houses near the crest of the hill, a senator named Quintus is beginning his morning in the manner of a man who has many more resources than Marcus, but is also in his own way, simply trying to get through the day without being required to do anything he does not want to do. Quintus is in his early 60s, a widower of 5 years, and he has the settled, slightly rumpled dignity of a man who stopped caring what other people thought of his personal habits sometime in his mid-50s and has not looked back since. His house is arranged around the traditional Roman atrium, the central open courtyard that lets light and air into the house and also serves as the primary reception space. Beyond the atrium is the tablinum, the main room where he receives clients and conducts business, and beyond that the garden, the peristylium, a colonnaded courtyard surrounding a garden that in June is extravagantly green and full of roses, which the Romans loved with a passion that is easy to underestimate if you only think of them as warriors and engineers. They were also, quite seriously, flower people. Roses, violets, lilies, and ivy were cultivated in Roman gardens with devoted attention, and the smell of a Roman senator's garden in early summer was, by all accounts, spectacular. Quintus receives no morning visitors today, which pleases him. Normally the morning hours at a wealthy Roman's house were given over to the salutatio, the formal morning greeting in which clients, social inferiors who depended on the senator's patronage, would arrive at the house to pay their respects. This was a mutual relationship, the client offering loyalty and political support, and the senator offering gifts, assistance, legal help, introductions, and occasionally actual money. The salutatio was a deeply embedded Roman social institution, but it was also, by the testimony of everyone who had to participate in it on either side, frequently exhausting. The clients who arrived earliest and waited longest in the atrium were often rewarded with the patroness's special notice. And then everyone would disperse again into the morning to pursue their various affairs. But today there is nothing scheduled, and the house is quiet, and Quintus drinks his breakfast wine, diluted as was proper with water and only lightly warmed, in the garden, with a book open in his lap. The book is a scroll, a volumen because the codex, the bound-page book, while it existed, and was used particularly for notes and records in its wax tablet form. had not yet become the dominant format for literary texts. Literary scrolls were typically made of papyrus, imported in enormous quantities from Egypt where the papyrus plant grew along the Nile, and was processed into sheets, which were then glued end to form rolls that could reach lengths of 10 meters or more for a substantial text. Quintus is reading Virgil. He has read Virgil many times, the Aeneid in particular, and at this point in his life he can recite large portions of it from memory, but he finds that reading the familiar words again in the garden, in the morning quiet, with the smell of roses around him, is a different experience from remembering them. The words have a different weight when they are there on the papyrus in front of him, shaped by someone's hand, present in the physical world. His household slaves are moving about the edges of his attention, the way the good ones always do, present without intruding. Managing the morning tasks of the house with the smooth efficiency of long practice. A young man named Demetrios, a Greek-born slave who manages Quintus's library and correspondence, appears at the garden doorway with a wax tablet containing a brief list of letters that arrived yesterday and have not yet been addressed. Quintus waves him away with a gesture that is neither unkind nor fully dismissive, somewhere in between. The gesture of a man who knows the letters will still be there tomorrow, and has made a conscious decision that today is not for them. Demetrios withdraws with the equanimity of someone accustomed to such gestures. The garden is quiet again except for a fountain, a small one, just a pipe set into the wall that lets water fall into a stone basin in a thin, continuous thread, making a sound that is almost indistinguishable from silence, but is much better than silence. Quintus is not a cruel man. He is aware, in the way educated Romans of a philosophical bent were sometimes aware, of the complexities of the institution of slavery that underpinned his comfortable life. And he has on several occasions, particularly after his wife died, and he began to spend more time with his own thoughts, found himself reading Stoic philosophy with what he would call intellectual interest, and what is perhaps something closer to personal instruction. The Stoics, and particularly Seneca, had things to say about the nature of slavery that were uncomfortable enough to stick in the mind. Seneca wrote that your slave is a human being, reasoning and capable of the same virtues as anyone else. He did not write that slavery should be abolished. The gap between philosophical unease and practical action was, in ancient Rome as in many other eras, a very wide one. Quintus thinks about these things occasionally, particularly in the quiet mornings when he is alone with his garden and his books. And then he sets the thoughts aside because he does not know what to do with them, and the roses are blooming, and Demetrios has organized his library with remarkable precision, and the morning is still. Young, down at the Forum, which is Rome's great civic center, the administrative and commercial and ceremonial heart of the city. The activity level on a slow day is different from the weekday roar, but not entirely absent. The Forum Romanum, surrounded by its temples and basilicas and the great rostra from which orators address the public, was always somewhat alive because it was the center point around which the city organized itself, the place to which paths naturally led and from which they departed. On a lazy morning, the lawyers are fewer, the crowds thinner, but the Forum is never entirely quiet. Street vendors have set up near the edges. A group of young men are engaged in the time-honored Roman activity of standing around and watching other people, supplemented by comment. A pair of priests in their distinctive dress are moving purposefully between the Temple of Saturn, with its great columns still standing today if you know where to look in modern Rome, and the Temple of Castor and Pollux. A philosopher of uncertain affiliation has established himself on the steps of a temple and is addressing a small audience of 3 people and a dog on the subject of the good life, using a style of argument that is more enthusiastic than it is structured. Rome had an extremely lively culture of public philosophy. Traveling philosophers, particularly from Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean, regularly made their way to Rome and held forth in public spaces, and the Romans, despite occasional official suspicion of philosophy as a destabilizing intellectual force, had an abiding interest in the subject. Stoicism particularly took deep root in Roman culture, from the courtroom arguments of Cicero to the private notebooks of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who wrote his famous Meditations, which survive and are still read today as a series of private philosophical reminders to himself, not for public consumption, but as a kind of ongoing conversation with his own better impulses. The idea that even the most powerful person in the world could sit down in the quiet and write notes to himself about how to be a better person is one of those Roman details that manages to feel both very far away and quite close at the same time. The children of Rome, and there were many of them, experienced the slow day with the particular joy of the young, who are always playing, and for whom the distinction between a slow day and a busy day is simply the difference between having many people to play with or slightly fewer. In the streets and open spaces, in the courtyards of apartment buildings, on the steps of temples, and along the banks of the Tiber where it was safe to go, Roman children played games that would be immediately recognizable in their essential structure to any modern observer. They played with balls, kicking them and catching them and throwing them at targets. They played with hoops, rolling them along with a stick, a game that requires somewhat more skill than it sounds, and that appears in Roman art and literature with enough frequency to confirm it was genuinely popular and not simply a decorative choice by artists. They played with knuckle bones, which were the actual bones of a sheep's ankle joint, used as throwing pieces in a game that combined elements of jacks and dice, requiring skill in throwing and catching, and some element of chance in how the pieces fell. Small clay animals and figures served as toys. Dolls have been found in archaeological contexts, some of them articulated with jointed limbs that could be moved, suggesting a level of craft and care in toy-making that reflects how much Roman parents, within their resources, valued play. There is a small open space near the bottom of the Aventine Hill where a group of children have gathered. Some of them know each other from their apartment building. Some of them are strangers who have been drawn together by the natural magnetism of an available flat surface and a shared energy. They are playing a game that involves a circle drawn in the dirt and a ball, and the rules appear to be in constant negotiation, which is itself part of the game. An older girl, perhaps 12, has appointed herself referee with a natural authority that the younger ones have accepted without much debate. Possibly because she is also the fastest runner and the best thrower, and it is useful to have her on your side. Flavia, who has gone to the baths with Tertia as planned and returned home by mid-morning, has settled on the windowsill of their apartment in the way that Romans often did, leaning on the sill and watching the street below. Tertia has stayed, and the two of them have the slightly conspiratorial comfort of old friends who have said everything important to each other years ago, and now mostly enjoy each other's company as a background presence while they talk about whatever surfaces. They talk about their children. They talk about the cost of grain, which has gone up slightly this month, and which is a matter of practical concern when you are feeding a family on a copyist's wages. They talk about a woman on the 4th floor who has a new companion about whom Tertia has strong and detailed opinions. They talk with the easy, unhurried specificity of women who have time this morning and are using it for exactly this. Roman women's lives varied enormously depending on class and circumstance, but for women like Flavia, wives of working men in the middle of the city's social spectrum, the public life of Rome was both more accessible and more restricted than it might appear. Women in Rome could not vote or hold political office. They could not plead cases in court or serve as senators. In the formal structures of public life, they were largely invisible. But in practice, in the lived texture of the city, women were everywhere, and their economic and social power was far from negligible. Roman women could own property and inherit it. They could run businesses. The wife of a craftsman or shopkeeper was typically deeply involved in the business itself, and legal records suggest that many commercial transactions involved women as full participants. Flavia helps Marcus by keeping his accounts, which she does in a small wax notebook with a stylus, tracking what comes in from the scriptorium and what goes out for rent and food and the children's shoes. And her management of these figures is what keeps the family comfortable rather than merely surviving. By midday, the city is at its warmest, and the pace of life slows even further, following the natural logic of a Mediterranean climate. This is the hour of the meridiatio, the midday rest, the ancient ancestor of the Spanish siesta, which is itself one of the things we have inherited from Rome without always knowing it. The Romans understood that the human body does not want to be active at the hottest point of the day, and they organized their lives accordingly. Shops that were open in the morning might close or at least slow. The streets emptied somewhat. People ate their midday meal, such as it was, in the shade, and many simply lay down and slept. The Romans had a complicated relationship with sleep that is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is so different from our own. We tend to think of sleep as a single block, a night's worth of unconsciousness from which we emerge in the morning. But historians and researchers have found evidence that before the age of artificial light, human sleep was commonly divided into two segments, sometimes called first sleep and second sleep. People would sleep for several hours after dark, then wake in the middle of the night for an hour or two of quiet activity, conversation, prayer, reading, or reflection, and then sleep again until morning. This pattern, which seems strange now, was apparently so normal in Rome and in earlier eras that it barely warranted comment. The historian Roger Eckerch, who documented this extensively in his research, found references to first sleep and second sleep scattered throughout ancient texts in ways that confirm it was simply the expected pattern. What this means for a Roman day is that sleep was more distributed, more woven into the hours, less concentrated in a single obligatory block. The midday rest was part of this larger pattern of following the body's rhythms rather than imposing a strict external schedule on them. On this particular lazy afternoon, Marcus returns from the baths and eats his midday meal, which is bread again and some dried figs and a little cold meat that Flavia has kept from yesterday. And then he lies down for a while. The apartment is warm. The children are temporarily quiet, which either means they have fallen asleep themselves or they are doing something he would not approve of if he investigated. He does not investigate. He closes his eyes, and the sounds of the city come through the window in the particular way they do in summer, slightly muffled by the heat. The voices of the street below rising and falling in a rhythm that is almost musical. He does not quite sleep, but he enters that restful state between consciousness and unconsciousness, where the body repairs itself without the mind noticing. The light on his closed eyelids changes as clouds move across the sun. Someone far below is playing a simple melody on an aulos, the double-piped instrument that was one of the most common in the Roman musical world, a wooden instrument with a reedy, somewhat melancholy sound, and the melody is uncomplicated and lovely and fades in and out as the player's attention or memory wanders. Music in Rome was ubiquitous. It was present at religious ceremonies and at dinners and at funerals and at the theater and apparently also on street corners on slow afternoons when someone simply felt like playing. Romans played string instruments including the cithara, which was the sophisticated, professional-grade version of the lyre, and the simpler barbiton. They played the tuba, a straight bronze trumpet used in military contexts and religious ceremonies. They played the litus, a curved horn. They played small hand drums and clappers, and the sistrum, a kind of rattle associated particularly with the cult of the Egyptian goddess Isis, whose worship had spread widely through Rome and was extremely popular by the 1st and 2nd centuries. They sang at parties and at work and at religious festivals. Music was not separated from daily life as a specialized professional art. It was, like so much in Roman culture, present everywhere and available to everyone. The afternoon drifts. This is the appropriate verb for what happens to time in Rome on a slow day. It does not pass, it does not race. It drifts like a leaf on the Tiber without urgency. The shadows lengthen very gradually. The heat begins almost imperceptibly to soften at its edges. The children are awake again, and the sound of them playing in the street filters up through the window. Flavia has gone to buy vegetables at the market, or what remains of the market at this hour, carrying her basket and accompanied by the boy because the girl has decided, apparently irrevocably, that she does not want to go to the market today and has been permitted this refusal because it is a lazy day and the emotional energy required to overrule her is not available. She sits in the apartment and plays with a small clay doll and is perfectly content. Let us walk now in the slow afternoon toward the Circus Maximus, because even on a quiet day the circus is worth visiting. The Circus Maximus was Rome's great chariot racing venue, the largest stadium in the ancient world, capable of holding perhaps 250,000 spectators at its height, which meant that on race days a significant fraction of Rome's entire population was in a single place, cheering and betting and eating and arguing. There are no races today, but the circus, which sat in the valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills, was a permanent feature of the Roman landscape, and its open spaces were used on non-race days as a kind of park and marketplace. Vendors had established themselves along the edges. There are fortune tellers, love potion sellers, quack doctors offering remedies for everything from gout to heartbreak. There are people simply walking, taking the air, enjoying the sense of space that the circus provided in a city that was otherwise extremely densely packed. Chariot racing was to Rome what football is to a modern city, but more so. The intensity of feeling around the 4 racing factions, the blues, the greens, the reds, and the whites, was extraordinary. Faction loyalty was not casual. People identified with their faction from childhood, inherited the affiliation from their parents, wore the faction's colors, spent money on faction-affiliated merchandise, argued in taverns about faction performances with a passion that made other subjects seem tepid by comparison. The Greens and Blues were the dominant factions by the 1st century, and the rivalry between them was at times violent enough to cause actual public disorder. The charioteer stars were genuine celebrities in the modern sense, recognized in the street, described in graffiti, commemorated in mosaic. One charioteer of the 2nd century, named Gaius Appuleius Diocles, retired after a career in which he won over 1,000 races and accumulated prize money that some modern estimates, converted to contemporary values, suggest may have been equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars. He retired at 42, which in a profession where the primary occupational hazard was being thrown from a chariot moving at 40 kilometers an hour around tight corners with other chariots inches away, was practically elderly. In the late afternoon, as the day begins its turn toward evening, Rome's taverns begin to fill. The Copani and Popani, the Roman taverns and wine bars, occupied an interesting place in Roman social life. They were, officially, regarded with some suspicion by the upper classes, who associated them with gambling, prostitution, and the general loosening of social order that alcohol and low company were believed to encourage. Respectable Romans were supposed to drink at home, with friends, at proper dinner parties where the conversation was elevated and the wine was diluted to appropriate levels, and someone read poetry aloud at the appropriate moment. But the reality was that taverns were where a great many Romans actually spent their time, and the archaeological evidence from Pompeii, which preserves a frozen snapshot of a Roman town at a moment in the 1st century, shows that taverns and food shops occupied almost every street in patterns that suggest their absolute centrality to daily life. The tavern Marcus occasionally visits is a small place. 3 tables and a counter at the front that faces the street with a gap in the masonry that allowed the servers to pass cups and bowls directly to people standing outside. A design that would not look out of place in a modern food market. The walls are painted with a deep red that has faded pleasantly, and there are painted figures on one wall. Venus and Cupid, and a generic drinking scene with idealized figures who look much better than anyone in the tavern actually does. The counter is built of stone and has large ceramic vessels, dolia, set into it, containing wine and perhaps olives or garum. The fermented fish sauce that was the universal condiment of Roman cooking, present in the cuisine the way soy sauce is present in East Asian cooking. As a deep savory background note in almost everything. Marcus goes in the early evening without Flavia, who is at home with the children. He sits at a table with Gaius again, who has somehow ended up here by a different route, and with another man from the neighborhood named Sextus, who is a freedman. A formerly enslaved person who has been granted his freedom, and who now runs a small dyeing business that is beginning to do well enough that he occasionally has surplus money and does not quite know what to do with it. The wine is diluted with water as it should be. Nobody is drunk. They are not trying to get drunk. They are doing what the wine is actually for, which is to provide a reason to sit down together, to have something to do with your hands, to soften the edges of the evening very slightly while you talk. They talk about many things in the course of the evening, these 3 men at their table in the fading light. They talk about the chariot races, specifically about a recent race in which a green faction charioteer named something that sounds like Fortunatus made a series of decisions around the spina, the central dividing barrier of the circus, that Gaius considers brilliantly tactical and Sextus considers reckless and lucky, and Marcus has no strong opinion about because he is not particularly invested in the outcome of chariot races, a position that makes him mildly eccentric in his neighborhood. They talk about the emperor in the careful way that Romans in a public place discuss the emperor, with a mixture of loyalty and rumor, and the implicit understanding that certain things were said in certain ways. They talk about Sextus's dyeing business and the cost of woad, and the difficulty of getting the deep purple color that wealthy customers wanted without using the genuine Tyrian purple dye made from sea snails, which was so expensive as to be essentially reserved for the imperial household. They talk about a dream Gaius had 3 nights ago that he considers highly significant and that he describes in considerable detail. The interpretation of dreams was a serious matter in Rome. Artemidorus of Daldes, writing in the 2nd century, compiled an entire encyclopedia of dream interpretation that was consulted earnestly, and the idea that dreams carried messages from the divine, or at least from the unconscious depths of the self, was nearly universally accepted. Gaius is convinced his dream means something good is coming to him in the next month, and he is not going to let Sextus's mild skepticism shake this conviction. The evening deepens. The lamp on the table is lit, and it throws a warm, small circle of orange light that makes everything within it look better than it does in full daylight. More people come into the tavern. The noise level rises gradually, the comfortable noise of people relaxing rather than the tense noise of people about to do something regrettable. Someone at the next table is playing a dice game. A woman comes in with a basket of herbs tied in small bundles for sale, and Gaius buys a bundle of dried lavender because he has a theory that it helps him sleep, which at this point in the evening is perhaps thinking ahead, but is also not unreasonable. And then, gradually, without anyone calling an official end to anything, the evening begins to close. The tavern does not have a precise closing time in the modern sense, but there are natural limits. The streets of Rome became dangerous in full darkness. Not everywhere and not absolutely so, but enough. The oil lamps that were placed at intervals in the streets did not provide adequate light once the moon was down or hidden. And the social contract of the night streets was looser than that of the day. Respectable people with resources traveled at night in groups or with torch-carrying slaves. Ordinary people simply went home. Marcus says his farewells, which are warm and slightly prolonged in the way of people who have spent a pleasant few hours together and are not quite ready to fully disconnect. He walks home through the streets that are now lit only by the light from windows and the occasional street lamp, and the city at this hour has a different quality from any of its daytime moods. It is not quiet because Rome was never quiet, and the carts will begin again soon as the night hours advance. But it has a kind of settled feeling, a sense of the day having worked through its shape and arrived at its natural end. He climbs the stairs to the third floor and opens the door of the apartment. The children are asleep. He can hear the particular quality of silence that sleeping children produce, which is somehow more total than any other kind of silence. Flavia is sitting near the lamp with a small wax notebook, going over the accounts, and she looks up when he comes in with an expression that says simply, "The day went well then." And he sits down near her, and they talk in the low, unhurried voices of people who have been through many days together and know how to speak without filling every space.